Howdy and welcome back. So we're going to continue our lesson on introduction to serialization and deserialization. Uh, I guess past lessons started to get a little bit long, so I decided to break it up over 2 days. So if you'll recall, we introduced what serialization is, what deserialization is. We talked about a couple of different formats for plain text files, and then we began to get into our serialization, deserialization example with movie objects to and from the CSV format. In the, I guess, application that we were thinking about in terms of this example, we were talking about the serialization and deserialization of movie objects to and from the CSV format. We said that our in-memory representation of a movie object would be as follows. We'd use a struct and it would contain 5 different fields, an integer, or 5 different attributes, an integer for tells an ID, a title, rating, release date, and description, all in standard library strings. We said that we'd essentially like to be able to serialize a collection of movie objects such as Gone with the Wind or Casablanca into a CSV file where essentially each field of the in-memory representation would be, or each attribute, sorry, of the in-memory representation would be written to a corresponding field in our structured file format. So if we look here, we can very clearly see that the first field of the CSV file is going to hold the title. That will be delimited. The second field will hold a title of a movie, again delimited by a comma. The third field will store the rating of a movie. Fourth field will store the release date attribute of a movie. Finally, the fifth field will store the description attribute of our in-memory object. Okay, so we went through a bunch of motions and we were essentially able to go from this in-memory representation to something, to a string that looks like a line of a CSV file, to essentially a function that would allow us to iterate over each movie within a collection of movies as stored within a vector and write that line representation to a file to more or less give that file the structured nature that one would expect from one of the CSV format. So we went from something like this in our application to a file that looked something like that in persistent storage. We then asked the next question as to, well, say we have a CSV format, how can we go ahead and go through that file and extract the records from it and recreate the in-memory representation of a movie object? So how could we go from the record for Gone for the Wind back into an actual movie object within our application? Likewise, how could we go from a record for Casablanca back into our in-memory representation of that object, a movie object? So the process was, I don't know, more or less similar. It was a little more complicated, but the idea was we'd go line by line through that file because, again, there's a record on each line. So we extract the line, and now we have to deal with this, with the different fields and parsing it out. And we came up with this function over here where we essentially would go field by field, pulling out each value and putting it into the corresponding field in our in-memory representation. We walked through this in the last video, but it essentially would allow us to jump from one field to the next. And again, when we call this substring from position to delimiter, we're assuming that we're already in the field and we're just reading up to the next delimiter, extracting that sequence of characters and throwing it into the corresponding field in our in-memory representation. And we just continued this process for each of these. And eventually at the end of this function here, we had created a movie object. Now, if you remember, the idea with this was that you'd have something like an empty movie object. Sorry, it's a movie, not a line. Movie M. We'd have a string, which might correspond to the line that we got out of, say, a file. And then we used or defined the insertion operator to simply populate the fields of that movie object from the line of the file. We then went ahead and put this together and said, okay, well, we have a way to go from some sort of string representation that has fields delimited with a comma into an in-memory representation of a movie object. How can we do that for each line in the file? We wrote an additional function that simply would extract lines from the file, put them essentially deserialize that representation into a movie object. Once it was there, we'd put that object into a collection of movie objects, a standard library vector of movies. And then at the end of this process, we simply returned that movie back. So this gave us the capability to go from this CSV file to a single function call, which would return a standard library vector of movie objects, thus completing the deserialization process. And now we're going to move on to kind of what's next. Let's say we have this collection of objects and we want to filter them. So extract out movies that have a specific attribute or many different, attributes that meet some sort of criteria that we're looking at. What if we'd like to sort this collection? Then maybe after we've interacted with our movies in memory, how could we go ahead and update the actual their representation in persistent storage? If we're reading them in, making changes, we probably want those changes to be reflected back into how we're persistently storing them. So we'll get into that in the next couple of movies here.